would you be willing to do if Vladimir Putin did not stick to the terms of any deal on Ukraine?
If he not what?
He did not stick to the terms of any deal on Ukraine, because he has a history of not sticking to his word when it comes to international agreements.
I think he'll keep his word. I think I've spoken to him. I've known him for a long time now. You know, I've known him. We had to go through the Russian hoax together. That was not a good thing. It's not fair. That was a rigged deal and had nothing to do with Russia.
We had to go through the Russia hoax together. Aw. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. First, he took the side and the word of Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence agencies in public at a summit in Helsinki during his first term. And now, within the curved walls of the Oval Office, Donald Trump did it again, taking the side of Russia's dictator over the findings of multiple investigations and intelligence findings, saying that Russia's interference in the 2016 election was a, quote, hoax. A stunning, but at this point not at all surprising remark that only deepens Trump's break with American institutions, American democracy, and American expertise. Another notch in the administration's shift toward autocratic tendencies. Peter Baker of the New York Times reports that what he's seeing now, quote, brings back memories of Putin's Moscow in the early days. Baker spent 4 years in Moscow when Putin first got into office, and now 20 years later draws parallels to what is unfolding here in the U.S. About Trump's second term, he writes this, quote, the news media is being pressured. Lawmakers have been tamed. Career officials deemed disloyal are being fired. Prosecutors, named by a president who promised retribution, are targeting perceived adversaries and dropping cases against allies or others who do his bidding. Billionaire tycoons who once considered themselves masters of the universe are prostrating themselves before him. America is no Russia. The history there is so fraught and complicated. Certainly, many Russian journalists would still rather live in Washington these days than Moscow, confident that America's tradition of free press and democratic ideals remains far stronger than what exists back home. But in decades of reporting in Washington under Republicans and Democrats, it has never felt quite like this. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Professor of History at New York University, Ruth Ben-Ghiat's here. Also joining us, voting rights attorney Mark Elias, the founder of Democracy Docket. Mark, the attacks against you are really the canary in the coal mine, if you will. They've been incessant since you defeated Donald Trump in court. I think 60 out of 61 times after his defeat in 2020. And just about everything that Peter notes there is something you've tangled with.
Yeah, that's exactly right, including going back to my time as the general counsel to Hillary Clinton's campaign. Remember, you know, the fact is that the Democratic National Committee was hacked by Russian intelligence services. And Donald Trump, rather than denounce that, he mocked it and suggested that he wanted Russia to release emails that might be in their possession. You know, it's interesting to hear Donald Trump say that that he has been through the Russia hoax with Vladimir Putin, and it has nothing to do with Russia. I'm not quite sure I even know what to make of that. But at every stage, Donald Trump has chosen the path of believing Vladimir Putin and siding with Vladimir Putin, and undermining and denigrating the United States intelligence agencies, United States law enforcement, and of course our allies abroad. And, you know, the thing that keeps coming to mind for me as I read Peter Baker's story and others is Hannah Arendt's description of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem and her famous phrase, the banality of evil. And what she was saying there was, in large measure, that the people who were around Adolf Hitler, these were not great men. These were very ordinary people. These were people who were not extraordinary. They fancied themselves, you know, extraordinarily smart and extraordinarily bright. They were not. They were just mediocre yes men. And it is that banality of evil that I feel like we are seeing. Where is Marco Rubio? You know, Marco Rubio claimed to be a cold warrior. Where is he today? He is just one of those mediocre men saying yes to Donald Trump. Where are the Republicans in the House and Senate who have claimed to be cold warriors to stand up for American freedom and values abroad? They are the banality of evil. They are the ordinary, mediocre people who, when their country needs them to do the right thing, instead fancy them part of some big movement, when in fact they are just pathetic losers.
Well, I mean, to follow up with you, Mark Elias, I think it's more than being mediocre men. It's being dishonest men. Tucker Carlson called Donald Trump a, quote, demonic force. J.D. Vance called Donald Trump, quote, America's Hitler. Mitch McConnell called Donald Trump, quote, a despicable human being. I've been on this program for close to a decade. I've never described him in terms that harsh. These are people who hate him, but are part of the lie to the MAGA base and the country. And now, as they refuse to stand between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and what seems like his desire to capitulate over the war in Ukraine, refused to stand up for American ally, Ukraine.
Yeah, they will be known in history as traitors to the country. I mean, these are people who, were given every advantage in this country's history. They were given the best opportunities in education. They were elected to high office. And rather than use those opportunities, rather than use their positions to advance the interests of their constituents, rather than use their power to help people who are less fortunate, rather than use their influence to keep freedom front and center in our foreign policy abroad. Instead, they were willing to sell all of that for the moment of fame and glory that they got standing next to Donald Trump's side. And history will remember them for the villains that they are. And, I can't say that is going to come soon enough, but I can promise you this: every single day, there are people who are fighting to make sure that they don't succeed. And we may win, we may lose, but we will continue that fight.
Ruth, what is the role of Republicans who privately have the harshest assessments of Donald Trump? I think I've had a large swath of Democratic officials and many dozens and dozens of former Republicans, everyone from Chris Christie to Mark Esper. And I've never heard Donald Trump described the way Tucker Carlson, J.D. Vance, and Mitch McConnell describe him: demonic, America's Hitler, despicable, all quotes. What is it that makes his most harsh critics become his enablers and accomplices?
Well, I'm glad Mark mentioned Hannah Arendt, because what we're looking at here is a moral collapse. And I'm just going to mention, it's been a long road of him, domesticating the party. He's coming into this new administration with a party that's become his personal tool. There's been various stories, Gabriel Sherman and others, about GOP powerful senators, powerful people who are afraid of Trump. And here I must mention, because I want to mention it every day, that Donald Trump tried to overthrow the government. And the genius of what he did, seen from a diabolical authoritarian perspective, is that he targeted Republicans as well as Democrats. His mob that he incited went after Mike Pence, his stalwart, faithful vice president. And what that showed from an authoritarian perspective is that no one was off limits, that the mob incited by Trump would harm anybody. And so people, Republicans were calling their family members, they thought they were going to die that day. And then they have had to kind of forget that trauma and publicly debase themselves by popping up and saying, yes, we're here for you, leader. And that causes a kind of, I think, betrayal of yourself, because authoritarianism doesn't only require you to betray others. It requires you to lose your own conscience. That's what Mark was also saying by mentioning Arendt. And this is very sad. It's very sad for the country. But that's when that collapse happens, people can lend themselves to all of a sudden siding with Vladimir Putin, who's a murderous kleptocrat, and leading the country down that path.